Your Honor, the evidence presented simply does not support the prosecution's claims. We ask the jury to consider the facts.
The courtroom atmosphere was charged with tension as the defendant stood alongside her attorney, awaiting the judge's attention. From the very beginning, it was evident that the central issue revolved around a bond violation triggered by a positive drug test for cocaine. The attorney immediately addressed the court, emphasizing that the defendant accepted full responsibility for her actions and that there were no excuses for the violation. She expressed her client's gratitude for the court's prior leniency in allowing her to remain out of custody, which had enabled her to continue participating in the mandated testing regimen. The attorney framed the defendant's actions not as a reflection of habitual misconduct, but as an isolated lapse, underscoring that this was her first positive test since the initial testing back in November. This initial framing served a dual purpose: to acknowledge wrongdoing and to appeal to the judge's sense of fairness and prior compassion, portraying the defendant as someone willing to confront her mistakes and demonstrate accountability. As the defense presented its argument, the defendant herself interjected, revealing a mix of anxiety, remorse, and determination to explain her side of the story. She highlighted her medical condition, specifically abnormal creatinine levels due to a kidney issue, as a factor that might have influenced test results. In the context of urine-based drug testing, abnormal creatinine can affect the concentration of substances, potentially resulting in false positives or anomalous readings. The defense's presentation of this medical explanation introduced a complex layer to the proceedings, compelling the court to consider whether the positive tests accurately reflected cocaine use or whether it was partially influenced by biological factors beyond the defendant's control. The judge, attentive and experienced, acknowledged the medical dimension while emphasizing that such factors could not fully absolve the defendant from accountability, demonstrating the balance courts must strike between technical evidence and legal responsibility. The discussion then turned to discrepancies between the defendant's statements to community corrections and the official lab report. While the lab had indicated a positive test for cocaine, the report from community corrections noted that the defendant had denied use. The defendant clarified that she had never intentionally denied cocaine use. Rather, she had misunderstood the terminology used by the lab representative, who referred to illicit drugs without specifying cocaine. This subtle miscommunication highlighted the critical role of precise language in legal contexts, where even small misunderstandings can lead to perceptions of dishonesty or obstruction of court orders. The defense's explanation sought to preserve the defendant's credibility by framing the issue as a genuine misunderstanding rather than deliberate deceit, a nuanced argument aimed at mitigating potential punitive action while demonstrating transparency and cooperation. Throughout the hearing, the court closely observed the defendant's demeanor. She appeared visibly stressed, reflecting the burden of caring for a special needs child while navigating the pressures of legal supervision. This disclosure served as a humanizing element, presenting the defendant as someone facing genuine personal challenges rather than simply a repeat offender. The attorney's appeals for leniency intertwined with these personal circumstances, emphasizing that accountability was paramount, but that compassion and understanding were also warranted given the context. By presenting this narrative, the defense aimed to frame the defendant's actions within a broader human context, suggesting that the isolated violation did not reflect a pattern of intentional disregard for court orders. A critical component of the proceedings was the defendant's admission of intermittent cocaine use. She candidly acknowledged that she had stopped and restarted at different times, a pattern characteristic of substance dependency. This honesty served to bolster her credibility while providing the court with necessary context for the positive test result. The judge's line of questioning regarding frequency and circumstances of use was intended to assess the severity of the violation, the risk of repeated offenses, and the appropriateness of rehabilitative versus punitive measures. The court's inquiry highlighted the dual role judges play in such cases, enforcing legal obligations while evaluating potential interventions to reduce recidivism and support rehabilitation. the interaction between the judge and the defendant, revealed the nuanced dynamics of courtroom authority and psychological strategy. The judge combined firm questioning with moments of humor and personal reflection, referencing his own experience in the system, thereby creating a space to evaluate honesty, self-awareness, and accountability. The defendant's responses, at times hesitant but generally candid, reflected a mix of anxiety, remorse, and determination to convey the truth. The attorney's role in facilitating this dialogue was pivotal, ensuring that the defendant's explanations were communicated effectively, without appearing evasive. These subtle exchanges underscored the importance of credibility, body language, and tone in judicial proceedings, where perception often weighs as heavily as written evidence. The procedural complexity of the case further illustrated the challenges inherent in bond violation hearings. Multiple sources of information, including lab results, community corrections reports, and the defendant's statements, needed to be reconciled. Discrepancies among these sources require careful clarification to prevent misinterpretation, as inaccurate assumptions could result in overly harsh penalties or failures to enforce compliance appropriately. The judge meticulously examined each piece of information, asking for clarification and verifying details, reflecting the high stakes involved and the critical importance of procedural accuracy. This careful review also underscored the broader principle that justice relies not only on objective evidence, but also on the interpretation of human behavior, intent, and context. Medical considerations continued to play a significant role in the court's assessment. The defendant's history of abnormal creatinine levels suggested that physiological factors might have contributed to anomalous test results, complicating a straightforward reading of the positive cocaine finding. In addition, she cited prior prescriptions and medical conditions that could influence testing outcomes, emphasizing that these were not excuses, but relevant factors for the court's consideration. The judge listened attentively, balancing the technical validity of the defense's medical argument against the clear legal expectation that the defendant abstain from illicit substances. The tension between biological explanations and legal accountability highlighted the nuanced nature of judicial deliberation in drug-related bond violations. Behavioral and psychological factors were also central to the court's evaluation. Defendant's stress, emotional responses, and attempts to explain her actions provided insight into her mindset and potential for compliance. The defense framed these elements strategically, illustrating that while lapses occurred, they were not indicative of a habitual disregard for court orders. The judge, experienced in interpreting such cues, considered both the objective violation and the subjective context, recognizing that effective adjudication requires a synthesis of factual evidence, behavioral analysis, and empathetic understanding. Repeated references to prior admonishments and compliance history provided additional context for the court. The defendant had previously been warned about missed tests and her interactions with community corrections staff, indicating a pattern of occasional lapses amidst generally compliant behavior. This historical perspective allowed the court to differentiate between isolated infractions and persistent non-compliance, informing decisions regarding leniency, continued supervision, and rehabilitative measures. The defense emphasized these nuances, arguing that while the positive test was serious, it should be viewed in light of an otherwise compliant history and demonstrated willingness to engage constructively with court requirements. Throughout the hearing, the procedural and strategic dimensions of bond supervision were evident. Drug testing served not only as a measure of compliance, but also as a tool for assessing risk and guiding judicial intervention. The defendant's case illustrated the complex interplay between medical conditions, personal stressors, communication challenges, and legal obligations. The defense's narrative wove these factors together, presenting a holistic picture of accountability, human vulnerability, and potential for rehabilitation. The judge, in turn, balanced the need for enforcement with the recognition of mitigating circumstances, reflecting the multifaceted considerations that shape judicial decision-making in cases involving substance use and bond violations. By the conclusion of this stage of the hearing, the court had gained a comprehensive understanding of the case. The defendant emerged as an individual who experienced intermittent lapses, but displayed a genuine willingness to accept responsibility. Her medical condition, personal hardships, and prior compliance history provided mitigating context, while her candid acknowledgement of cocaine use demonstrated honesty and credibility. The defense's framing emphasized accountability and potential for rehabilitation rather than punitive action alone, highlighting the nuanced strategies employed in such hearings. The judge's attentive questioning, careful review of documentation, and consideration of behavioral cues exemplified the delicate balance of authority, empathy, and procedural rigor that characterizes effective judicial oversight. This first portion of the case thus illustrated the complex dynamics of bond violation proceedings involving substance use. It demonstrated how legal, medical, and behavioral factors intersect, influencing both courtroom strategy and judicial evaluation. The narrative revealed the importance of precise communication, credibility, and context in shaping outcomes, while underscoring the court's role in balancing accountability with opportunities for corrective intervention. Through a careful synthesis of evidence, personal circumstances, and behavioral assessment, the court was positioned to make an informed decision regarding leniency, continued supervision, and rehabilitative measures, setting the stage for the subsequent proceedings that would determine the defendant's legal trajectory. As the proceedings continued into the second phase, the courtroom dynamic shifted subtly, reflecting the judge's increasing engagement with both the defendant and her attorney. The judge, demonstrating a blend of firm authority and perceptive insight, began to probe more deeply into the defendant's explanations, her past behavior, and the implications of her positive cocaine test. From the outset, it was clear that the court was not merely interested in the factual occurrence of a bond violation, but in understanding the full context surrounding the incident, including medical, behavioral, and personal factors that could influence both compliance and future risk. The judge's questions were methodical, often layered with subtle cues designed to assess the defendant's credibility, self-awareness, and willingness to accept responsibility. Each question seemed calibrated to evaluate not just the facts but the defendant's demeanor, her capacity for honesty, and the consistency of her narrative, highlighting the nuanced role that interpersonal perception plays in judicial decision-making. The defendant, while visibly anxious, attempted to articulate her position with careful attention to both honesty and explanation. She reiterated that her positive test was an isolated incident and emphasized her history of compliance since the initial testing months earlier. She acknowledged her intermittent cocaine use, framing it as a struggle she had actively attempted to overcome, stopping and restarting at various points, which is consistent with the behavioral patterns commonly observed in individuals with substance dependency. The judge's line of questioning regarding the frequency, timing, and circumstances of use was critical, serving to differentiate between habitual abuse and sporadic lapses. By eliciting detailed responses, the court aimed to gauge both the severity of the violation and the likelihood of future compliance, thereby informing potential decisions regarding continued supervision, rehabilitative measures, and appropriate consequences. The discussion then circled back to the discrepancies between the lab report and the community corrections documentation. The lab had indicated the presence of cocaine in the defendant's system, while the community corrections report stated that she had denied use. The defendant clarified that she had not intentionally denied use. Rather, she had misunderstood the terminology when a representative referred to illicit drugs. This exchange highlighted the critical role of precise communication within the justice system. Misunderstandings of this nature can dramatically affect judicial perception, potentially framing an individual as dishonest when, in fact, the discrepancy is the result of semantic confusion. The judge listened carefully, weighing the defendant's explanation against her overall compliance history, the medical context, and the objective evidence provided by the lab. The court's ability to reconcile these sources of information illustrates the complex analytical task judges face when evaluating credibility, intent, and the appropriate scope of judicial intervention. Throughout the hearing, the defendant's demeanor remained a focal point for evaluation. She exhibited signs of stress and anxiety, reflective of her responsibilities at home, including caring for a special needs child, and the pressures of living under court supervision. These personal circumstances were not presented as excuses, but as mitigating factors that could inform the court's approach to leniency and rehabilitation. By openly acknowledging these challenges, the defendant's attorney aimed to humanize her client, portraying her as someone who, despite lapses, demonstrated a genuine effort to comply and improve. The interplay of personal hardship, remorse, and accountability created a multi-dimensional profile, challenging the court to consider both the legal and human elements of the case. The judge's responses during this stage of the hearing were notable for their combination of firmness and measured empathy. At times, the judge employed humor and self-reflection, referencing his own experience to put the defendant at ease while simultaneously testing her honesty and engagement. This approach allowed the court to assess behavioral cues such as body language, eye contact, and verbal consistency, all of which are integral to evaluating credibility and determining appropriate judicial responses. The subtle interplay between authority and accessibility in the judge's questioning highlighted the role of courtroom dynamics in shaping both defendant behavior and legal outcomes. By balancing firm enforcement with perceptive understanding, the judge maintained control of the proceedings while ensuring that the defendant had an opportunity to be heard fully and fairly. A recurring theme in the dialogue was the defendant's acknowledgement of her past mistakes, her understanding of the consequences of her actions, and her expressed commitment to compliance moving forward. The judge probed these statements, seeking concrete evidence of commitment, such as participation in testing programs, willingness to engage in treatment or counseling, and acknowledgement of prior admonishments. The defendant cited her history of generally compliant behavior, her medical condition, and the complexity of her personal life as context for her lapses. By presenting this nuanced narrative, the defense sought to frame the defendant as someone capable of improvement rather than as a repeat offender who should face immediate punitive consequences. The procedural aspects of the case remain central to the court's evaluation. Drug tests, reports from community corrections, and prior documentation of missed or positive tests all served as data points in a broader pattern analysis. The court meticulously examined the interplay of these sources, considering how medical conditions, test reliability, and communication discrepancies could impact the interpretation of results. This procedural scrutiny underscores the multifaceted nature of bond violation hearings, where legal outcomes are informed not only by objective results, but also by the accuracy of reporting, the clarity of communication, and the behavioral context of the individual involved. The judge's careful attention to these details exemplified a commitment to both fairness and precision, ensuring that any ruling would be grounded in a thorough understanding of the case. Medical context continued to influence the court's perspective. The defendant's abnormal creatinine levels were repeatedly referenced, demonstrating how biological factors could influence drug test outcomes. Abnormal creatinine, which can result from kidney dysfunction or other health issues, affects urine concentration and can potentially lead to anomalous readings in drug tests. The defense argued that this factor could have contributed to the positive cocaine result, framing it as a complicating variable rather than an indicator of deliberate misconduct. The judge, acknowledging the validity of this explanation, nevertheless emphasized that medical factors alone could not negate responsibility, highlighting the balance between technical evidence and legal accountability in judicial decision-making. Behavioral analysis also played a crucial role in the court's deliberation. The defendant's emotional responses, expressions of remorse, and attempts at explanation were all observed and interpreted as indicators of credibility and potential for compliance. Courts often rely on these behavioral cues to assess risk. evaluate the sincerity of admissions, and determine whether rehabilitative measures are likely to succeed. The defendant's willingness to admit to intermittent cocaine use, her acknowledgement of prior mistakes, and her efforts to explain mitigating factors all contributed to a more comprehensive understanding of her overall behavior and character. The judge's evaluation of these elements was as important as the factual record itself, reflecting the integrated nature of legal, medical, and behavioral assessment in such cases. Repeated references to prior interactions with community corrections and prior admonishments illustrated the pattern of behavior the court had been monitoring. The defendant had previously missed tests and had been warned regarding her conduct, with staff indicating a history of occasional lapses amidst generally compliant behavior. By examining this pattern, the court could distinguish between isolated incidents and consistent non-compliance, informing decisions regarding leniency, rehabilitation, and ongoing supervision. The defense emphasized these nuances, arguing that while the positive test was serious, it should be contextualized within an overall record of compliance and demonstrated willingness to adhere to court directives. As the hearing approached its later stages, the discussion turned to potential legal outcomes and strategies for ensuring compliance moving forward. The judge indicated that, given the isolated nature of the violation, the context of personal and medical factors, and the defendant's general compliance history, there was room for consideration of rehabilitative interventions rather than solely punitive measures. The court's focus on rehabilitation reflected a broader philosophy often observed in bond violation hearings involving substance use, balancing enforcement of legal obligations with opportunities for corrective behavior and long-term improvement. This approach underscores the court's dual responsibility to uphold the law while also facilitating positive behavioral change. The interplay between courtroom strategy, legal obligation, and human behavior became increasingly evident. The defendant's attorney skillfully framed her client as accountable, remorseful, and facing significant personal challenges, thereby humanizing her case and influencing judicial perception. The judge, in turn, engaged in detailed questioning to probe the depth of honesty, consistency, and understanding of consequences. This dynamic exchange highlighted the importance of credibility, precise communication, and the integration of behavioral and medical insights in judicial evaluation. The courtroom thus functioned as a complex environment in which legal, personal, and behavioral factors intersected, shaping both the immediate proceedings and potential outcomes. By the conclusion of this portion of the case, the court had developed a nuanced understanding of the defendant's situation. She was positioned as someone who had committed an isolated infraction, but who demonstrated a willingness to accept responsibility, engage with corrective measures, and navigate complex personal and medical challenges. The judge's assessment incorporated multiple dimensions: factual evidence from lab tests, documentation from community corrections, medical context, behavioral observations, and the defendant's personal circumstances. This holistic evaluation provided a foundation for determining an appropriate balance between leniency, supervision, and potential rehabilitative measures, illustrating the multifaceted considerations inherent in bond violation cases involving substance use. The hearing provided a detailed exploration of courtroom dynamics, judicial reasoning, and the integration of behavioral, medical, and legal factors. The proceedings demonstrated how courts navigate complex cases, balancing the enforcement of rules with opportunities for rehabilitation and consideration of human circumstances. The judge's probing questions, careful attention to credibility, and methodical analysis of documentation underscored the importance of comprehensive evaluation in determining outcomes. Meanwhile, the defendant's candid admissions, acknowledgement of prior lapses, and explanation of mitigating circumstances highlighted the strategic and psychological dimensions of courtroom advocacy. Together, these elements form the detailed portrait of the interplay between law, behavior, and personal circumstance, setting the stage for subsequent decisions regarding supervision, compliance, and corrective intervention, and illustrating the intricate realities of judicial oversight. In cases of bond violations related to substance use,